student, welcome to our program of Science Third Prep Stage. Today we are going to talk about Unit 3, Lesson 1, the main principle of heredity. What's meant by genetics and what is the kind of trait? How the trait transfer from parents to offspring. Let's go to our lesson. The main principle of heredity. What's meant by genetics? Genetics, it is the science that researches the transmission of hereditary trait from one generation to another by studying the similarity and difference between parent and offspring. Again, genetics, it is the science that researches the transmission of hereditary traits from one generation to another by studying the similarities and difference between parent and offspring. Firstly, what the kind of traits? Again, what is the kind of traits? Hereditary traits. The first one, hereditary traits. They are traits that transmitted from one generation to another. Again, hereditary traits they are a trait that transmitted from one generation to another. For example, hair color, eye color, skin color, and blood group. Again, example for hereditary trait: hair color, eye color, skin color, and blood group. The second one of trait is acquired trait. What's meant by acquired trait? They are traits that aren't transmitted from one generation to another. Again, they are traits that aren't transmitted from one generation to another. For example, playing football, writing, and swimming. Playing football, writing, and swimming. Note: hereditary traits transferred from one generation to another by reproduction process. The first note in our lesson today: hereditary trait transferred from one generation to another by reproduction process. In asexual reproduction, the children produced from one parent cell exact similar. Again, as we studied, in asexual reproduction, the children produced from one parent cell exact similar. In sexual reproduction, the children produced from two parents are similar or different. Again, in sexual reproduction, the children produced from two parents are similar or different. Gregor Mendel is the first scientist show how traits pass from parent to offspring. Again, Gregor Mendel is the first scientist show how trait passed from parent to offspring. He performed his experiment using bee plant. He performed his experiment using bee plant. Mendel used bee plant for reasons. Again, Mendel used bee plant for reason. It is easy planted and grow fast. Again, bee plant, it is easy planted and grow fast. So, give reason, Mendel used bee plant for his experiment because it is easy planted and grow fast. Another reason, its life cycle is short. Its flower hermaphrodite, so it can be self-pollinated or pollination. Again, its flower hermaphrodite, so it can be self-pollination. It can be artificially pollinated by human. Another reason, it produces large number of plants in a generation. It has several pair of easily identified contrasting traits. Again, it has several pair of easily identified contrasting traits. He chose 7 traits to do his experiment. For example, flower color. There are 2 types of flower color, purple and white. Again, the first property of bee planet, flower color. There are 2 types of flower color, purple and white. Plant height, tall and short. There are 2 types of bee plant. There are tall plant and short plant. Seed color. There are 2 yellow and green. There are 2 yellow and green. Seed shape, round and wrinkled. Again, there are 2 types of seed shape, round and wrinkled. Bud color. There are green and yellow. Bud shape, full and flat. Flower position, axial and terminal. Axial and terminal. Mendel's experiment to study the seed color of the bee plant. Again, Mendel's experiment to study the seed color of bee plant. Mendel planted bee plant that produced purple flower and another one that produced white flower. For many generations, why or gave reason to make sure of the purity of this trait. He made that by self-pollination. Again, white flower or why Mendel planted flower for many generations. To make sure of the purity of this trait, he made that by self-pollination. He planted the seed of both plants, and after growing, he removed the stamen of these plants before they become mature to control the pollination. Again, he planted the seed of both plants, and after growing, he removed the stamen of this plant before they become mature to control the pollination. By means of cross-pollination, he pollinated flower of the plant which produced purple flower. Again, by means of cross-pollination, he pollinated flower of the plant which produced purple flower with pollen from the plant which produced white flower, and vice versa. Then he covers the stigma of pistils in order to prevent the pollination from other flower. Observation. In this experiment, he observed that plants produce first generation are purple flower plant and the white flower are disappear completely. Again, he observed that the planet, all planet produce first generation are purple flower plant and the white flower are disappear completely. So he called what? Purple flower is dominant trait. There are 2 types of dominant also. There are type of trait. The first is dominant trait, and the other trait is recessive trait. Purple flower, which appear in the first generation, is a dominant trait, and white flower which disappear in the first generation is a recessive trait. He left the first generation self-pollinated and he planted the resulting seed to get the second generation. Again, he left the first generation self-pollinated, and he planted the resulting seed to get the second generation, in which 3/4 is purple flower and the quarter are white flower. As the figure, A capital pure dominate or purple flower. Again, symbol of dominate or pure dominate purple flower, we can write A capital. When purple flower dominate purple flower with white flower A small, the first generation as shown, all generation are purple flower. First generation 100% dominate. A capital A small can call hybrid on one dominate and one recessive purple flower. Hybrid as A capital A small, one dominate and one recessive purple flower. The second generation, when purple flower from the first generation, A capital A small and A capital A small, the second generation as shown, there are 3 plant of purple flower and 1 plant with white flower. Second generation 75% dominate, 25% recessive. The principle of complete dominant. He repeated the same experiment, Gregor Mendel, he repeated the same experiment for the rest trait, and he found that the long stem dominate the short stem. The red color of flower or purple color of flower dominate the white color. The side position of the flower trait dominates the end position. The smooth seed trait dominates the wrinkled seed. The swollen bud trait dominates the sinuous. The green bud color dominates the yellow bud. He observed in the end of the experiment that one of each pair that trait disappear completely in the first generation, as we studied. Again, he observed that one of each pair of trait disappear completely in the first generation. Then the 2 contrasting traits appear in the second generation in the ratio approximately 3:1. Mendel named the traits that appear in the first generation as a dominant trait, and the trait which disappear in the first generation as the recessive trait. Again, Mendel named the traits that appear in the first generation as the dominant trait, and the trait which disappear in the first generation as recessive trait. The principle of complete dominance, again, the appearance of a dominant hereditary trait in the individual of the first generation when 2 individuals are crossed over. One of them carries a pure trait, A capital trait, concentrating the trait carried by the other individual. At the last of this lesson, complete the following. There are 2 types of traits in the living organism, dominant and recessive. Again, there are 2 types of traits in the living dominant and recessive. The scientist has conducted the main principle of heredity. Mendel, again, the scientist Mendel has conducted the main principle of heredity. Gametes are formed in the first generation by, again, gametes are formed in the first generation by meiosis division. The life cycle of the bee plant is short. Again, so Mendel used bee plant because the life cycle of the bee plant is short. Bee plant can be pollinated, self-pollination, or artificially pollinated by human. Again, bee plant can be pollinated as a self-pollination or artificially pollinated by human. The trait appear in the first generation only, while the trait appear in the second with a percentage 25. Again, the dominant trait appear in the first generation only, while the recessive appear in the second with a percentage 25. The bee plant is hermaphrodite, so it could be self-pollinated. Hermaphrodite. The bee plant is hermaphrodite, so it could be self-pollinated. Another question in this lesson, write the scientific term. They are traits that aren't transmitted from one generation to another. Again, they are traits that aren't transmitted from one generation to another. Acquired trait as writing, playing football, and etc. They are traits that transmitted from one generation to another. They are traits that transmitted from one generation to another. It is hereditary trait. As hair color, eye color, and etc. It is a science that researches the transmission of hereditary trait from one generation to another by studying the similarities and difference between parent and offspring. It is the definition of genetics. Again, genetics means the science that researches the transmission of hereditary traits from one generation to another by studying the similarity and difference between parent and offspring. The appearance of dominant hereditary trait in the individual of the first generation when two individuals are crossover. Again, the appearance of dominant hereditary trait in the individual of the first generation when two individuals are crossed over. One of them carries a pure trait contrasting the trait carried by the other individual. It is the principle of complete dominance. The trait disappear completely in the first generation. What is the trait disappear completely in the first generation? It is a recessive trait. Another question in our lesson, a mating between hybrid bee plant with red flower R capital R small and another one with white flower R small has occurred. Again, if we said a hybrid bee plant with red flower, we will write R capital and R small because it is a hybrid trait. But a pure trait as a white flower R small. But why R small? Because it is a recessive trait. Again, R capital R small is a dominant trait, but it is a hybrid, not pure. R small as a white flower is a pure recessive trait. Again, pure recessive trait. If a mating between hybrid R capital R small and a pure recessive trait, what will happen? Illustrate using heredity principle that trait of the result generation. Illustrate using heredity principle, the trait of the resulted generation are capital or small as a hybrid, not pure red flower or purple flower with white pure flower. The answer of this question, red flower and white flower are mating. As a parent are capital or small red flower, or small as a white flower, as a pure trait. Again, parents of this mating is red flower or capital or small. As we said, it is a not pure or hybrid trait, as a hybrid dominate trait. But white flower is a pure because the recessive trait will be pure. Formation of gamete as shown. Formation of gamete in meiosis division are capital as a gamete, male or female, are small as a gamete, male or female. If we consider that the red flower is a female, so are capital female or small female. Again, red flower as a female, so are capital or small as a gamete in meiosis division, or capital and or small as a female or ovum. White flower, if we consider that is a male plant, so formation of gamete are small and are small as a pollen grain. When a mating between R capital and R small as shown, again R capital meet R small or pollen grain fertilize ovum of R capital, it will produce red flower or purple flower. If R capital meet R small, again R capital and R small, it will produce red flower. If R small meeting, it will produce white flower. Again, R small meet R small will form or will produce white flower. Our observation in this mating is red flower and white flower produce as a first generation or a generation when the mating occur between red flower as a hybrid R capital R small and white flower as a pure R small. Red flower 50% and white flower is 50% also. Again, if a mating occur between hybrid trait and recessive trait, the family or the first generation, it will produce as a 50% and 50%. 50% as a hybrid trait and 50% as a recessive trait. Dear student, I hope to enjoy your time with us. Try to answer the question of this lesson after study it very well. Till we meet you again, goodbye and good luck.